Alright everyone, we got ourselves a new uh, tornado risk to go over. Nothing too crazy, not thinking tornado outbreak, but maybe a tornado or two. It's not today, so this is Saturday. Slight chance of storms in northern Missouri. Tomorrow, we get ourselves a bigger risk, including a marginal risk. A lot of that is for wind, so these storms could have stronger winds with them. And hail, probably not going to be much of an issue. And there's a little bit of a tornado risk that is now focused on Illinois and Indiana. It did encompass a larger area this morning, including parts of Missouri, but that area has been removed, and now it's just up here. Not sure if there was a downtrend or if someone decided that the someone just had a different preference, the forecaster, than the previous. I don't know for sure. But something to look into. Nothing. And then beyond, after tomorrow, there's a bit of a cool down, and there's nothing really too notable in the future to look at. So, we'll go to our jet stream. This forecasted winds high up in the atmosphere, 500 millibars. And here is our trough. So, it is a pretty big trough, and that's often the kind of troughs that you see work a little bit further to the east than the Great Plains. And at the moment, this trough, it's not your big classic U-shaped, super well-defined trough. Sometimes that's not always what you need. In the winter, out here east, what's usually gonna drive a tornado risk is a lot of it is gonna be the elevated mix layer, because that is gonna be what fuels storms to strengthen, and that's the main ingredient that's almost always missing in the winter. And so we see a risk area, Illinois and Indiana. The winds are currently coming from the desert southwest, so that makes me think there is going to be some dry air aloft, which will probably increase the instability. So with time, this is about when the risk is going to be underway. We see this, it's almost like these two sort of weird troughs kind of combine. This one's already about to become a close low potentially. But yeah, we see by tomorrow morning, they sort of combine and it turns into a nicely shaped, um, yeah, it turns into a nicely shaped trough with some strong winds. 80 knots in there, even close to 100 at places. So, deep layers here doesn't seem like a big issue here. And we have a strong closed low, which is often favorable for tornado setups if you can get other things right. One thing that is interesting to note is you do see some southerly flow, or northerly flow, sorry, on the backside of this trough. And what that could potentially do is prevent that elevated mix layer from coming in. That could lead to a little bit more moist upper levels, which could decrease instability and lower the tornado risk. But we see the part of the trough that was from the original one still is bringing in some of that dry air. So I'll be interested to see how much of an elevated mix layer we do get with this. We can also check height falls to see how strong the forcing will be. If we're going to be looking at a strongly forced linear storm mode, or if we're going to potentially see discrete supercells. That is a little bit questionable. So we see early Sunday morning, we get the 500 millibar heights here by these dark lines. And we do see it's not the strongest decrease in 500 millibar height, so you know it could be some sort of a mixed storm mode. We could see squall line, but we can't rule out any discrete storm stuff, which means strong tornado. I mean, technically couldn't it be ruled out, but the risk doesn't seem super high overall, so I sort of tend to doubt it. So we do see we're in the blues here, so heights are falling in this region, like we were talking about. So it does look like something where earlier in the day, storms could be a little bit more discrete, but as the day continues, there will be stronger forcing, stronger height falls at 500 millibars, and that will likely decrease the strong tornado threat if it was even there, and also force these storms into a squall line, which is where you can sometimes see weak tornadoes develop. They're a little bit more unpredictable though, so that is always something to watch for. Alright, 700 millibar winds. Nothing too crazy we have to look for here, we just need to see that they're there, and they are definitely there. Okay, so we don't have, doesn't seem like, well, a little bit of a close low, 700 millibars. Slightly veered winds, but main thing here is there are strong winds at 700 millibars, no weak winds, usually not an issue in the winter. Low-level jet, 850 millibar winds. We do get that close low, which is almost a given for any tornado setup. At 850 millibars, you're almost always going to see that. It is a little bit almost straight to the north of the risk, and that does veer the winds a little bit, which is not as favorable for tornadoes, because, well, there's reasons there. But yeah, winds are going to be coming potentially almost straight out of the west, with a little bit of a southerly component as well. But in terms of strength, there's going to be a pretty strong low-level jet. It's just going to be which direction are the winds going to be moving. If we get this low to develop a little bit further to the west, that could allow for a more southerly component, bringing in that moisture, and that would increase the tornado risk. But this is probably one of the big things holding back this risk from a kinematic standpoint. Alright, we'll look at our dew point and our wind barbs, so surface winds. So I guess we can probably just check real quick what we're looking at right now. I believe these lines right here, these pink lines, that might be fog. Wouldn't surprise me because there's a lot of fog where I am, which is in the St. Louis area. So winds coming out of the southeast. That's pretty expected for the day before a risk. That's usually what happens. Mid-50s, mid to low 50 dew points. In our risk area, some 40s. And yeah, we do see some of that moisture already up, not the 60s dew points, but that is going to develop, and we do see a surface low develop early morning Sunday in Kansas. That brings up that moisture, and we see this low moves pretty quickly off to the east mostly by 18Z, which is potentially when we could see the highest tornado risk. We do see a good swath of 60s dew points. It is very close to the surface low, the main risk area here. it is kind of to the north a little bit. So the direction of the winds could be a little interesting. Not sure exactly what's going to happen. We got our cold front and dry line right here. But here's something we should check. So this is 30 hours out. So our surface low is right here in northwestern Illinois. Where is our 850 millibar low? So a little bit off to the north. So that should mean for a risk area, there probably won't be a huge component of directional shear in the lowest kilometer, which does favor a tornado risk. It doesn't decrease it. So yeah, low 60 dew points. We can now go to a high resolution model. We'll go 18Z HRRR and go to our Ohio River Valley region. So HRRR seems also on board with the 60 dew points being pretty well achieved. Surface low, it has a bit of an interesting surface low. It's a little bit further east. That could potentially lower the risk. We'll see where it also puts the 850 millibar winds. And kind of a similar area, but there could be some directional shear in the lowest kilometer, which is my theory for that is it's not as favorable for the low-level thermodynamics. Alright, because you usually want to see if any change in humidity, you want to see humid air just above the slightly drier air. Alright, future radar potentially. We see these early morning storms up in northeastern Missouri and Illinois. These are probably not going to be the main thing. Let's check. Yeah, so we can see that there's just about no surface-based instability. That's because there's an inversion. So this is north of the warm front, which means temperatures are still pretty cool at the surface. And our second band of storms, this is interesting. So HRRR does not show very robust storm development until a little while on. Almost have to wait until these storms get into Indiana before they really do anything. We can check here in St. Louis to see what the environment is, and it's not a very bad environment. Surface-based CAPE above 1,000 with that elevated mix layer near 700 millibars. We do see a little bit of a temperature inversion, but I'm honestly not convinced that's gonna keep storms from firing. There should at least be some rain, I think, because this is kind of a pretty favorable thermodynamic profile, in my opinion, for this time of year. So I'm not sure why the HRRR doesn't have a little more robust development. Maybe it's just the storms aren't ready to go. I'm not sure. Hodograph, big issue here is minimal curvature at all. So critical angle 28. That is definitely going to lower the tornado risk a little bit. Just kind of straight hodographs, but these are the kind of things where if you get an 850 millibar low that turns a little bit southwest, you could get a little bit more backed winds. A little bit more backed winds at 850 millibars. That increases the critical angle to maybe 40, 45, which should probably greatly increase the tornado risk. So at the moment, there is a lack of curvature. This is always something that can be changed in the short term. Deep layer shear looks fine, and in terms of just speed shear in general, it is fairly favorable for tornadoes. So yeah, this does look like a decent tornado risk. Nothing crazy, but it does surprise me a little bit that there's not as much. We'll see what it looks like here. So we see there is a line that forms. It does form along, I'm assuming this is the cold front / dry line, and that does seem to have a bit of a southwest to northeast orientation, which for tornadoes in a line, the most favorable orientation is north to south, so a little bit more vertical. So that questions the linear tornado risk a little bit. Let's check the environment here. This is a little interesting. Maybe it's just because instability here is not quite as high. You don't get as much elevated mixed layer, which would theoretically weaken storms, but perhaps it's just because by now the forcing will be stronger. These storms are just going to simply be forced up by a very strong cold front. Photograph here looks more favorable in my opinion. A little bit more backed winds at the surface and stronger curvature, but you still get those that speed shear that we're seeing elsewhere. So 40 knots of 0 to 1 kilometer shear, critical angle 37. Still not super high, but that is better. Sometimes just 10 degrees difference in the critical angle can be the difference between tornadoes or not. We'll check the risk a little bit further south, see if anything's happening here. Shows weaker instability here. And photographs that are a little bit more just pushed down, squashed. I don't know. Do one more here. Yeah, it's a little interesting. Here's our cape. We can just look at that real quick. So Cape kind of peaks in Illinois. Very, very weird winds here with very little curvature. Elevated mixed layer here, a little lower than you typically want to see for a tornado risk. And I think we'll look at one more model just for fun before we finish up. This is the RFS newer model. So it does show some of these updraft tracks in Illinois early morning, but I'm kind of skeptical of that. I think this is north of the warm front, so that could potentially just end the tornado risk. I'm not sure how legit those are. So there's the first waves, potentially a hail up here. I'm not sure. Yeah, lots of updraft tracks up here. So we'll see if that can become surface-based and produce anything. But here we go. RFS showing some discrete stuff up here, and that eventually weakens and dies off. So most impressive at around 3 o'clock this is. So could be watching 3 o'clock Illinois for potentially a supercellular tornado risk. RFS is kind of well known for hyping up a tornado risk, but I do think this is something to look out for a couple tornadoes. Not a slam dunk, obvious tornado outbreak kind of thing, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they do upgrade to a 5% risk if we get a little bit more curvature in those photographs. Alright, I think that'll do it. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.